Hello everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome if this is your first time and welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you. I talk a lot of books, so if that's the kind of thing you're into, then please feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you here again. So I've got my new reading journal for 2022 here ready to go, and I've got my goals set out, ready to chat. So let's do that. So first of all, my overall number goal of books that I'd like to read this year, and basically from here on in, is 52. So I've decided I'm just going to read or aim to read a book a week, and if I read more than that, that's great. If I read less than that, that's also fine. I don't want to sort of, I've looked at people who can read more than 100 books a year, and I'm like in awe of those people, but I don't think I have the lifestyle at this point to be able to commit to being able to read that many books. So I think 52 books is still an ambitious goal, and if I can meet it, then I'm going to be super happy. But if I don't quite get there, that's okay too. So within that sort of more broad number of books I'd like to read, I've also got two categories of books. Well, sort of three. One's not really a category of books. Anyway, I'll tell you. So I want to read at least 15 Australian books this year. And I also want to read at least 10 classic novels. So those are the two kinds of books that I want to read. And then my other goal is to read at least 10 ebooks. And the reason for that is that I keep getting ebooks when they're on sale, and I have amassed a crazy amount of ebooks in my e-reader that I just always forget are there because I can't see them. They're not on a shelf with the spine facing out that I can say, oh yeah, there's that book that I wanted to get to. So I've got all of these books, and then also I can't remember why I bought them, because I've read the synopsis at the time and decided it was something that I would like to read, but obviously if I bought it 3 years ago, I can't remember what it was about. So I see the title, and especially those books where the title doesn't really tell you what it's going to be about. So, anyway, I want to read some of my ebooks this year. That's one of my big goals. I want to start clearing those, and not buy too many more of them because I just keep buying them and forgetting that they're there. So those are my three sort of sub goals under my goal of reading 52 books, and I'm ready to track them. I'm yet to put in my January stats, but I will do that at some point soon. And then on my next page, I've got my Australian Reading Challenge 2022. I've made a whole video about that, which I'm going to link up in the cards. So that if you would like to hear more about that, you can. But basically, I've created a challenge over on the StoryGraph, and anyone is welcome to join. There are 12 prompts, one for each month, and each of them will be a prompt for an Australian book. So I've already started to fill mine out because I've read 2 books now that meet the criteria for 2 of my prompts. Then I've also joined somebody else's challenge. I don't have the name to hand, but you can go and find this challenge also on the StoryGraph. It's called a Classic a Month Challenge. Now, I believe that their intent was to read, so the first prompt is a classic from the country where you live. Then there's a translated classic written by a Black author, a classic genre novel, etc., etc. And I believe in the challenge those are linked to months. I'm ignoring the months, and I'm just going to read them in the order that I feel like reading them in. So again, I have already read 2 that will meet 2 of the prompts. I unfortunately started to write one in the wrong spot. So that's that. And then I've also got my ebook tracker. There's going to be a little bit of overlap there, but that's okay. And then I have started to list now the books that I have read with my rating next to them. So I don't know if you can read that, but I have had a pretty good month in terms of ratings, nothing lower than a 4. So that is a good start to the year, in my opinion. So let's get into them. The books that I have read in the month of January. So I started out by finishing off a book that I read the bulk of in December. So it's a bit cheeky, but also I didn't meet the goal of reading that book before the end of the year. So it's my little compensation, is I get to start the year with a book that I was just finishing. So it's Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. It's a Nigerian book, and the author, it was written some time ago, so it's a classic. I absolutely loved this book. I read it on my e-reader. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars as my rating, and it was so compelling. I really, really loved it. So basically, the plot is that we follow this man who is a very proud man within his, I guess you would call it, his tribe or his community, and he's a very proud man. He's a leader within the community. He's looked up to by people. He has his faults. He can be quite, he can be cruel. He can be a little bit stuck in his ways with things. He certainly does not behave in a way that I would say is kind to his wives or his children. So it's, yeah, he has his faults. He's not a perfect character by any stretch of the imagination, but basically we follow this man, and it is the sort of the point where things start to fall apart, as the title suggests, which is to do with colonialism. So it's when the colonial powers make their way to his community and what sort of happens as a result of that. So it really made me think about colonialism. So obviously I live in a country, Australia, where white colonialism has had a massive impact as well. I am a white person living in Australia. I am descended from people who migrated here. There are convicts as well in my history, which most white Australians will be able to tell you is the case in their families too. So it is a sort of a really challenging thing to think about and to reflect upon, especially knowing that you are a beneficiary of colonialism and of that privilege of having white skin. But I think it's important to do. It's important to think about the impacts of these things that happened in the past and how they still are impacting today. So this book definitely made me think about that. It also, it's about the thought processes that are behind that sort of colonial mindset, that the way that the white people thought their way was better, or that they, were more correct. The double-edged sword of missionaries coming in, who also have that same mindset, that colonial mindset. Perhaps they have good intentions, perhaps they have, the will to do the right thing, but they're also bringing their very human, ways of thinking with them too, and destroying communities in that way as well. I guess one of the other things, there were some problematic things, as I sort of alluded to before, that we've got, a man who is a very dominant husband and father. He dominates his wives. He has 3 wives. He also has this idea that only one type of man is acceptable. It's sort of like, a very problematic toxic masculinity, if you will, in the way that we talk about it today. But definitely, some complexities to him as a character. So I really liked the way that this book talked about traditional culture in this area of Nigeria, and he didn't shy away from talking about some of the negative aspects of things. He wasn't sugarcoating the traditional culture or trying to say, that it is in every way superior or anything like that. And I really appreciated that. He wasn't sort of glossing over some of those more toxic traits that are a part of those social structures. But he also was celebrating those things that are amazing about that culture, and you know, how happy a lot of the people were prior to white people coming. And yeah, so it's a really complex sort of issue, and I think he's done a really good job of talking about all of those things in a way that's really accessible, but also is, you know, in its own way, very very true to the author and to an honouring of the cultures within Nigeria. So from that book, which was, you know, quite hard hitting and in many ways a difficult read, I went on to read this book, which is Mutton, Fish, The Surviving Culture of Aboriginal People and Abalone on the South Coast of New South Wales. So this is a non-fiction book. It's written by Beryl, Cruse, Liddy, Stewart and Sue Norman. And the reason that I decided to pick this one up at the time I picked it up, because I've owned it for a little while. I heard about this book when I believe it was referred to in Bruce Pascoe's book Dark Emu, which I read a couple of years ago. And there was a story that was mentioned there that sounded really fascinating. So I looked up the book and purchased it at the time. So I've had this book for a couple of years. But the reason I picked it up and took it with me on my holidays was that I was going to the area where this book is kind of set. So I was holidaying on the south coast of New South Wales and thought it would be a good place to read this book and kind of learn more about the history of the area. So this was really, really fascinating. It was definitely, so it was written in the early 2000s, I believe. Let me just double check that. 2005, so mid 2000s. So I'm sure that some of the things that they referred to towards the end of the book, more has probably happened since then, and there would have been some progress that wasn't able to be talked about in the book because of when it was published. However, I really loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, and it really made my holiday kind of come to life, and the places I was reading about come to life, because I was literally sitting in a house that was, you know, in the area that they were talking about. And I learned a lot about Aboriginal people's connection to abalone in the area, which is they called it mutton fish. Well, they had a name for it, which I cannot remember, but I will quickly look up. Walkun, Walkun, and then it was referred to as mutton fish, but we know it today as abalone. So they had a real connection to abalone in terms of feeding themselves and, you know, sort of cultural events and so on, and taking care of their community. It's also, I learned a lot as well about the history of the interaction between Aboriginal people and the government, in terms of the rules that were being made for collecting abalone and sort of how much they were allowed to take, and, you know, how it was allowed to be prepared and so on. You know, the red tape, the governmental red tape that has been put in place to make it really difficult for people to use abalone in the way that they culturally would have done, you know, in years prior. And then I guess also beyond abalone, I learned about some other things in terms of the Mabo legislation and its limitations. For example, and this was at the time of writing, I don't know if this has changed since then, but one of the things that the Mabo legislation requires, for people who are not in Australia, Eddie Mabo was a campaigner for areas to be given back to the original inhabitants. So he led the first successful legal case to for that to happen. So we just call it Mabo legislation now, and it's basically the legislation that allows for people and governments to hand back areas of land to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. So, however, one of the things that you required for to sort of, for this court case that you're doing, is you had to provide proof of use prior to 1788, which is when Australia was discovered by white people. So how racist is that? Like, because the evidence that, you know, in a culture that is primarily, you know, a spoken language culture, as opposed to, you know, there was no writing back in those days. You are reliant on the records of white people who making those records of what was happening when they arrived in the sort of early days of the Australian colony, or the, you know, the various colonies around Australia. And when they're writing about those things, that's not their intent in writing. And also, you know, there was a language barrier there. There were so many things that would impact on, you know, what was recorded and the perspective from which it was recorded, as well as, you know, they're not thinking, you know, those people who were writing about it at the time were not thinking about it in terms of it's being used as evidence so many centuries on. So, you know, it's white invader accounts of what they've done. And, you know, it just makes me so angry to think about it, but it's something that I hadn't reflected on before. So, you know, I really appreciated being able to think about that when I was reading this book. And if you are someone who lives in New South Wales, I'd highly recommend it as you know, a really fascinating account of the ways in which a particular food source has been used for such a long time, and also just like just looking at the ways that you know, even just for people to continue using that food source, how governments make that so difficult for them to do in a very, you know, legal way. So yeah, really fascinating read, and I was really glad to have been able to read that book. The next book that I read was a 4-star read for me, and it is The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. Now, this was really unlike anything I've ever read before. So it sort of had what I would consider to be like fantasy, magical realism kind of elements to it. And also a little bit dystopian. So it sort of defied classification, I guess, in terms of where you would place it if you were dividing your shelves that way. Thankfully, I am not. It's my own random order that I have my shelves in. So I guess as I was sort of finishing the book, you know, it sort of, my thoughts were in a bit of a whir as to like, you know, what to make of the ending of the story, and even the characters, like what to make of them as people. I think for me, the theme that came out so much in this book was the impact of trauma beyond the traumatized person. So in terms of, you know, the decisions they make as a person and how they interact with other people. That was a major theme in this book for me. Beyond that, I thought the evolution of Zoe as a character was the most compelling storyline in the book. I felt like the finale was a little bit open-ended for my liking. So, you know, the way that the book concluded, I was not satisfying for me. It may be for other people, but I did enjoy this book. As I said, I gave it 4 stars, but yeah, I don't know. I still, even now, still don't quite know what to make of it. So, proceed with caution, but I did enjoy this book, and if that sounds like the kind of thing that is up your alley and you don't mind an ending that doesn't sort of neatly wrap everything up, then this may be for you. Then what did I read next? Flip the page. Okay. Then we get on to my final Austen. If you've been following me for a while, you will know that I've been reading the Jane Austen books in their publishing order, and Persuasion was the final book to be completed by Jane Austen at the time of her death. So I finished it, and I have to say, I think this is my new favourite. So for so long, Pride and Prejudice has been my favourite Austen, and I still do love I still do love Pride and Prejudice, but Persuasion has taken the cake for me. I adored the protagonist in this book. Her name's Anne. I feel like Anne Elliot is a great character. She, for some reason in my head, I thought she was an insipid character, and I don't know where I picked up that idea from, but she definitely wasn't. She was really, she's not insipid. She's not silly. She's not full of herself like some of Austen's previous heroines. She's smart, she's thoughtful, she knows herself as a person. She doesn't have any annoying traits that need to be, fixed by a man or, via a lot of self-reflection. She's already just a good person. Certainly she has some things against her, and there are things that are going on around her that she doesn't have control of that make her life a little bit difficult, but she doesn't lose herself within that. She remains herself. She's strong. I just loved her. She was so good. And also I think it was really an unproblematic Austen as well. If you've been watching some of my wrap-ups over previous months, you will know that I did not love some of the storylines in terms of them being a little bit problematic. So I was so glad to read this one. It's also really short, which always is a winner. And what else have I written about this? Yeah, she finished strong. Austen. Well done. Loved it. And I will be very, very happy to recommend this one to anyone. So if you're an Austen fan, if you love Pride and Prejudice, I would say that you will also love Persuasion. So please get a copy of it if you can. Right, the final book that I read this month, in the month of January, was on an ebook, so I don't have a physical copy of it. I did order one, and then it got destroyed in the mail and was returned to sender, and they said, we're really, really sorry, we don't have any other copies to give you, so here's your money back, which thankfully I got my money back, but very annoying not to get my physical copy. But anyway, I was able to read it on my e-reader. Actually, I read it on my iPad because I didn't want to pay for it on Kindle because I already had access to it on Scribd. So I read it on my iPad, which I wasn't a massive fan of, but I did like to be able to highlight it and those kind of things. Anyway, the book is called Sexologies by Gabriela Weiner. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and this was our book for my Reading Around the World book club that we read. So she's a Peruvian author, and this is a non-fiction book. So she has a journalism background, and she wrote articles for various magazines and so on. So this was a collection we discovered in our book club because one of the people in our book club read I think German translation of this book, which was an earlier translation, whereas everybody else in the book club had read the same version that I read, which was a later English translation, and it didn't have the same articles in it. I mean, some of them were the same, but there was an entire section of articles from the earlier translation that weren't in the translation we read. So that was really fascinating to see the evolution of this book and decisions that had been made either by the author or by publishers or by the translators, I'm not sure, to include completely different articles, and also to kind of mess with the structure that had been there in that earlier one. So that was quite interesting. And not everybody loved this book. Some of us really didn't like it in my book club, but I did enjoy it. There was some just really interesting, it wasn't what I was expecting at all. So basically, from the title, I was expecting that some of these articles would be about sex, or perhaps it might have been about gender, or, being a woman, or, those kind of things. And some of them were definitely about that. However, some of them just seemed quite random, and none of us could quite work out how they fit in. But those articles that we were confused about were not in that earlier translation. So we're wondering if there was a kind of change of direction between those two iterations of this same book. But anyway, either way, I really liked it anyhow. I thought the translators did a really, really good job of making the language really poetic. So, you know, sometimes when you read a translated book, you wonder how much has been lost in that translation, not just in terms of meaning, but in terms of the selection of particular words that the author might have chosen, you know, because there might be multiple ways that you could translate them. So I felt like that they had worked really hard to kind of create this kind of poetic language, which I'm assuming is a good reflection of the original text from the author. So they made really, really good word choices. There were some hard-hitting moments for sure, and there were some, for me, quite relatable, and then some were just really, really out there. But I think this book is going to sit with me for some time. There was certainly some really interesting reflections in there about being a woman, about sex, about, you know, the different ways that people have relationships, and you know, the impact of those choices that people make on other people. So it will definitely sit with me for some time, and I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars as my rating. So that's it. That was my January. I started the year strong. I'm really happy with the books that I read, and I would be very happy to recommend any of them to anyone. So hopefully you've heard about a book here that you might not have heard about before. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Do you have any different opinions about them than I do? Do you hate Persuasion? I can't imagine that you do, but if you do, I'd like to hear about it, because, you know, we have different opinions, and that's okay. All right, well, that's it from me for today. So thank you very much for sticking around to the end, and I look forward to chatting with you on my next video. Bye.